Greetings, everyone, and welcome to the Complexity Lounge, a meetup where we gather to talk about all things related to complexity and complex adaptive systems. I'm Jocko, and I co-host the lounge together with Barbara Frontera and Tiani Jones. Today, we welcome Dave Noll to the Complexity Lounge. Dave began his career at Boeing in 1986, working in manufacturing and industrial engineering before undergoing a career change to become an internal organizational development consultant in 1996. In 2007, he encountered the Cynefin Framework and began using it with senior leadership at Boeing. And today, Dave will be sharing his experiences and observations regarding his use of complexity thinking and methods from his 37 years at Boeing, covering social systems, roles, identity, and behavior, as well as his experiences in introducing Cynefin to executives. So Dave Noll, welcome to the lounge.
All right, thanks. So I was thinking around focusing on using complexity approaches with leaders. And then I thought of, the old meme, one does not simply walk into disorder. And the whole idea, this is very ambiguous. You can interpret it in a lot of different ways, whether it's one-on-one with people or with groups or a whole company. And definitely applies to, all of the above. One does not simply walk into disorder. My pre-Boeing experience, I moved around a lot. I have a business degree, I have a speech degree, I have a master's degree in human resource management. I worked in hospital finance and got absolutely, totally bored. And so then I went and smuggled Bibles into restricted countries. And then I got married and had to find a job and ended up at Boeing. So that's kind of the first 28 years of my life in one sentence. And so kind of looking at those experiences, and then also a lot of, I'll call that amateur anthropology, which I think has kind of served me well in my Boeing career. As you kind of notice things, there's a lot of tribalism going on. So I'm going to start with three really quick short stories. So one thing that hit me is that identity, roles, behaviors, they're fluid. And depending upon the roles people are playing, the part they're playing at that point in time, people will behave differently. And we've probably all been in that situation. And, just think about how many of you have ever been in a meeting, it's the very last meeting of the day, and you're actually going through a role transition from, my work role to, wherever I want to be next, my friends and family role. And you're at the very, very end of the meeting, and then somebody asks a question. And everybody in the room just wants to get out of there and go home and make that transition. And, they've kind of violated that role transition that people are in. And everybody's rolling their eyes inside you're looking like Munch and the Scream, don't do that. Don't do that. We want to leave. And it's because you're actually going through a transition to a different role, and someone has disrupted that because you're in a different set of behavior. Actually will behave and respond to those questions differently than you would have in your normal working role, because now I'm in my next identity, my home identity, and I just want to get out of there. And so I may blow the question away in order to get out of the room. And so, it's just kind of a simple illustration around times where our behaviors will change when our roles are in these transitions to another role. Another thing I noticed in a meeting that I was in, early on in my career, we used to negotiate schedules to parts to the airplane. And we would try to put a new part on a plane in the assembly line. Of course, the line's moving, and you've got to get it in the airplane on time. In worst case, you can have this thing called a line stopper, where the part is so late, they actually have to stop the assembly line. And what happens in this case was, there's all the normal functional infighting and all that stuff that goes on in companies. But when it's a real crisis like a line stopper, the next thing that happened is I found myself in a room with the vice president, some senior leaders, top engineers, mechanics from the floor who put that particular part in. It was all levels of the organization. We were all in the same room, and they literally sat in a circle. This was in the 80s, before circles were the things you did. And they just sat in a big circle, and they just went around the room and listened to everybody. And it was the context of a real big problem. They changed their role, and they actually behaved differently to solve that big problem. And at that time, I'd say that was one of the strengths, is when there were big problems, they behaved differently and they actually collaborated. So it's kind of interesting, but it's context actually shifting the behaviors. And then the last example of this kind of behavior shift, and it was someone that I knew well. It was one of my clients who was at the director level at the time. And he was talking about someone that was leading the program, and said, if you're with that person in a social setting, away from work, they're like the nicest, most wonderful person that you would ever want to be around. But when they come into work in the morning, he drives to the gate. The words he uses, he puts on the mantle of vice president, program manager, and he becomes an ogre. And it's a case of that person was transitioning to a different role, and he was adopting a different set of behaviors. So you kind of notice this, like these behavioral role changes, this fluidity. And it just kind of makes you think, like, what's really going on here? So to think about it, this is the excursion into Italy I was talking about. Let's go back 700 years. This is one of my favorite buildings in Florence. It's the Bargello, and it was built in the 13th century. It was the city hall of Florence at that time. And the plaques on the wall are all from the noble families. So that's kind of like one level of social strata that's going on. The families were a big deal. My last name is Noll. If you're a Noll, we know what Knolls are like, for good or bad, right? We know what the Smiths are like. We know what the Johnsons are like. We know the families. And that's one layer of identity or role. And then other layers of roles back in the medieval times were the trade guilds. And the trade guilds control the day-to-day business activities. It's interesting that this is the Bargello, that was the city hall, in the 13th century. They actually replaced it with the Palazzo Vecchio later on, much bigger, grander building. And the plaques on the Palazzo Vecchio are actually the plaques of the 9 top trade guilds. So it's like the trade guilds kind of superseded the families. Although the trade guilds were all run by the powerful families. But one of the things that's interesting is that collaboration is fluid. It's based on shared, objectives, your roles and identity. So, families would cooperate with certain families and not with other ones. Trade guilds would cooperate with certain guilds when it benefited them and not with others, but there could be anti-guild competition too. The classes were another layer, the rich class, the middle class, and then you had the poor class, were actually often contract laborers who were excluded from the guilds because there were a lot of barriers to entries to the trade guilds. And then you had the city level of identity. So they may have a lot of infighting or not very much collaboration between the families, the guilds, and class, but we all know we all hate Siena. And that was in, the 1300s. Siena was the big enemy. Later on in the 1500s, it changed to Pisa. But you have these dynamics where people would band together in order to, have the common interests of the city. And then you even had higher levels where some cities would band together because they were pro-Pope. They were the Guelphs. And then they had the Ghibellines, who were actually more pro towards the Holy Roman Empire. So you have all these forging, coalitions, alliances, behaviors. You would cooperate depending upon which level and which of those roles or identities you're holding at that point in time. So it's very fluid. So why am I talking about 700 years ago? If you look at a company, we often have very, very similar social systems layered in there. The work groups, in a lot of ways, are the family equivalent. That I had a lot of street cred at Boeing because I actually entered the system in, they call it change board at the time, where we negotiated changes to the airplane. And it was a sort of a manufacturing operations role. It created ties that benefited myself, through the rest of my career in the company, even though I'd only, worked there for the first 12 years. It's kind of like your family of origin. The functions are really the equivalent of the trade guilds. They're still alive and well. The guilds are still there. The class structure is the formal hierarchy. We had, the vice presidents and then directors were both the executive class, and then, senior managers, and so on. Engineers, we had non-management technical experts who maybe had, greater authority than some others, and so on. And then you have programs level. So, in commercial, we had 3.7, 4.7, 6.7, so on. The programs, sites, the Everett site has multiple programs, but there's often loyalty around that, and so on. And then you have the business units. So you can look at a lot of organizations, and I would say there's a lot of parallels to this kind of structure. It's like those medieval structures are still in place. And I'm not saying, you just flatten everything. It's kind of like they are what they are. So it's something you need to think about when you're working in the system. So I first used these, the slide when I was asked to do something on culture change with the group of managers, and it was more around how do we change the behaviors of our employees. And so I just made this up, said, I'm going to just try this, see if it works, with a vice president and all his directors that were like all the engineering leaders for the airplane programs. And we went through this, and the main point, the direction we took this was, if you want to change behaviors, then you need to get people operating in the same roles or the same point of view. So if you want functions to work together, then you have to take a higher level program point of view. And that in order to change behaviors, you get a lot more traction disrupting the structure than you do trying to change behaviors and ask people to behave differently. And we even got down to the micro level around, there's sort of a metaphor for a lot of meetings, in person, where you have the manager sitting at the end of the table, the leader, their top person to their right, all the top people sitting around the table, the other people sitting against the wall. And it has a very strong, I'll just call it the king and their court feel to it. And if you want to change behaviors in the meeting, you need to disrupt that feel. Now, there's some managers we worked with that are really good at that. And that was part of the discussion. Like, the leader sits at a different place every time. They always invite people to the main table, first come, first serve. If another vice president's late, they sit against the wall. You mix up the structure, and you can actually change some of the behaviors in the meetings. And then you ask people, that aren't just, the main people, you ask questions like, what do you think about this? So disrupting the structure can actually change how things function. So sort of one last interesting point about this too is that when you do this kind of disruption, actually I lost my train of thought. When you do this disruption, you change behavior. So the interesting thing, and I'm just going to kind of stop here, and then we're going to fast forward to 2007. So in 2007, I'd been doing consulting for about 10 years within the company. And I had come to several cynical, I'll call that conclusions. Most changes want to go from A to Z, and they usually only get to M, maybe. The other thing I noticed is scale increases, traditional change models fall apart. The old going from the current state to the desired future, and then you kind of figure out the gap and you build a plan to close it. The bigger the change is, the more scale. It just doesn't work. The list of all the new behaviors are futile and oppressive. You can't ask people to change 10 things about themselves. It's not going to happen, and I don't think it's the right thing to do anyway. The whole thing, resistance to change, is usually weaponized against people who ask really good questions. The organization immune system, we used to talk a lot about this. The organization immune system is going to fight it. And that's true, and that's not always a bad thing. That the immune system, sometimes they're right. So you really need to think about, well, why are they fighting this? What's going on here? During initiatives, functional groups are really brilliant at getting a new system in order to operate in and recreating their old jobs in that new system. And then the organization development as a field has grown stagnant. And 18 years later, I'd still think it's pretty stagnant. That's where I ended up sort of moving more to looking at the neuroscience or the complexity theory. So this is where I was in 2007. I had a coworker who gave me a DVD of Dave Snowden presenting to a group he was doing as Ashen and the Cynefin Framework. And for me, that was like a really eye-opener. Let's go to there. And when I saw the Cynefin Framework, it was one of those things that validated a lot of stuff that was already in my head, but it gave me a different way to talk about it. And so I went online, I'm looking around, and I noticed that Dave Snowden was teaching a class in November in Vancouver, BC. So I went ahead and signed up for that, and that's where I met Dave. Also met Michael Shovel-Dave, Gary Wong, they were there. And went through the class, and I started using the Cynefin Framework or talking to people at that time about it and sharing it with them. And, fortunately at that time, I was working with the product development, new technology group were my main clients. And product development is an area that often operates in the complex domain. And so that was a group that was able to pick up on this really, really quickly because they saw the relationships between the different domains. And while I was doing this, so this was like late 2007, I kept running into people saying, there's this other guy talking complexity at Boeing named Steve Holt. And you need to talk to him. And apparently people were doing the same thing to Steve, going, hey, there's this other guy talking complexity. Dave Noll, you need to talk to him. So Steve and I got together, and we ended up, using the Cynefin Framework. I think Steve signed up for the next class that Dave Snowden was taking. And we were sort of off to the races being, although call it co-allies, complexity ambassadors for the Cynefin Framework and the Boeing company. So that's kind of the journey. Let's talk about using it with execs. And kind of going back to the different medieval social systems. One of the big things when you're sharing these kind of things with others is you really got to think about, this whole king in their court metaphor. And you do not want to share new stuff in those kind of environments if you can all but help it. You want to try to get in a place where you're in a much more informal place where the structure is a lot different. Well, that was that comment I was going to make about the king and his court, that in some ways I think that's why this whole emphasis on the return to work and getting people back on site is a lot of leaders like that whole king in their court metaphor. They want people in the room. That hybrid, virtual meetings are actually disruptive to the way they prefer doing things because they like being the king. That's my amateur psychologist 2 bits right there. But you want to try to get away from those environments, and you want to try to get in informal type environments. And one thing I found when you're approaching execs, you've got to know who their right-hand person is. In our system, it was often the business operations director. On the defense side, it was often their finance director. Know who schedules their meetings. Sell your ideas at that level to them so you can get in the room. You really want to try to approach them in small group conversational ways. Get around a table. Not big presentations. I often had like 1 or 2 pieces of paper that I may not have even got to, but I would have maybe the Cynefin Framework and some kind of model or something that I had drawn out, and you just talk about it. One of the things I always did when introducing the complexity principles to executives is I tried to avoid, I call it the P word, which is problem. People always want to go, well, what's the problem? What's your problem? And try to focus on, instead of what the problem is, focus on, well, tell me about the situation. What's going on here? Describe what's going on. And don't talk about the root cause. We have people who always talk about, root cause analysis and all that. It's like, well, instead of looking for a root cause, let's describe contributing factors. What's contributing to this? Let's not arrive at conclusions too quickly. Let's really examine what's going on. And one thing, this is more a danger sign. I don't know how many times you've seen a problem statement that has a predetermined solution that's embedded in the problem statement. And you got to really watch for that. The problem is we don't have a database to keep track of everything. Well, that's not the problem. Because it's the predetermined solution is we need a database. That's like a real life example. I actually won an award for building a database, which I knew was not solving the problem. But sometimes you do what you need to do. And you also work to solve the problem simultaneously. And in that case, the problem was more relational with the people who wanted the tracking. So you really got to think about, what's the real problem? Look out for those danger signs of predetermined solutions and really talk about exploring the situation. And when I introduce it to executives, I often talked about, how messy is this? Is it like really clear what you need to do? Or is it really messy? This is what messy looks like. And then I would use the definition for complex around messy. It's nonlinear, it's unpredictable, there's unknown unknowns, it's something that maybe you can influence it, but it's not controlled. It's dynamic and evolves over time, and solutions emerge. So, this is kind of the environment you're working in contrast to with, the more complicated environment. And I've actually done a lot of work with groups just talking about these 2 domains, complicated versus complex, and how do you operate in these 2 different areas. We actually did a thing for first line managers in the factory, and we have them write on Post-it notes, what are the issues you're dealing with as a first line manager? And then we had them put them on as a complicated or as a complex, and they filled it up, and they had kind of a collective aha that the work was complicated, but the social system they operated in was very complex. And then that can lead you to discussion around, you need to handle that in a different way. So often this is like a good starter approach for talking about things, and it may be all you need. And never even mention Cynefin, never mention complex adaptive systems from the point of view of, the whole theory behind it, but just talking a lot about this is what a complex system looks like. And then how do you operate in that? So after doing this for a while, Steve and I were actually asked to do a class on leading in complexity to all newly promoted directors and vice presidents of the Boeing company. And we actually did it for a couple of years. You know, it's funny because I was working at the time for the learning and development vice president for the company, and he actually ran the Boeing Leadership Center and kind of presented the idea of doing this class. You know, they bought into it, and Steve and I were asked to put together a pilot. So we did a couple pilots classes and it went over really well. And then what happens was their philosophy of training at the time for their executives was they call it leaders teaching leaders, where all those classes had to be taught by vice presidents. So we created the content and they turned it over for a couple of sessions with vice presidents leading it. And Steve and I got really good results. And when vice presidents did it, totally tanked. And so they asked Steve and I to continue. So we can both say that we were like the only two non-vice presidents, and we were not even managers, of teaching leaders classes at the Boeing company. We did that for a couple of years. We took turns. One session, they'd have a director's class and a new vice president's class. And then I would do that, both of them. And then Steve would do the next 2 months later, and I'd do the one after that. We just alternated. So a couple of things happened when we did this. When we presented Cynefin, we presented it using this slide, and we talked a lot about the cause and effect. And the cause in, the clear in the order domain, the cause and effect, the chain is very, very straightforward. You do A, you get B, you do, get B, you do C. Complicated is very context dependent. So there's still these causal changes, but it can go different directions based on context. In a manufacturing setting, we would talk about, the whole location and the part is different, then the stress analysis is different. And so you do E if it's in one place, you do C if it's another place, and so on and so on. Now, these complicated relationships can get very, very, let's say, complicated. There can be a lot of different paths, a lot of different ways. You can have a lot of argument among experts about, the context and which way you go, but you can still eventually figure it out. And then I kind of go to chaotic, which is all the variables are scattered and nothing seems to be joined together. And that's when you go into firefighting mode, which actually we were pretty good at. But then you get to this complex area. And this is where it gets really interesting because you do A, and then it's like there's this big cloud of variables. And you can't see them all because there's so many. And you do A, and the first time you do it, M comes out. And M may have been good, so they'll say, well, do A again, but then all of a sudden you get Q, and Q's not good. And then you get Y, and that might be mediocre, and you're like, well, what happened? And then the interesting part is when you're the sort of life in the cloud is often the cloud will blow away after the results happen, and you can see the path that it took, which in a lot of ways can fool you that you were in complicated. It's the old hindsight is 2020. So a lot of discussion came up with executives around, excuse me, what life is like in the cloud. Because most executives, they're in a really weird spot from the point of view where many of them realize that they're in a complex system. And yet their boss may be living in a complicated world and may be looking for complicated solutions. So in a lot of ways, you have to pretend that you're doing a complicated approach, even though you've got to do things that you need to do in a complex system. And so they're always kind of torn between this world. So That's one thing to think of. And another thing that often comes up, and I've had these in one-on-one discussions, usually with senior vice presidents who report to the C-suite, and I'll just call it the curse of McKinsey, where McKinsey will come in and say, if you do X, you can save $500 million. And then that boss has just been assigned to do X. And they know that it's extremely complex, highly unlikely, and yet their leaders are expecting them to, put together a plan and save $500 million. And so what do? Now, that's a really tough spot to be in. And then you combine that all with, I'll call it the false attribution of success and failure in these systems. And we had a CEO, pretty much any failure he attributed to bad leadership. Where if you talk to a lot of leaders, and I think a lot of us, whether you're in leadership or not, we've all been assigned projects where we look at the conditions, we look at the environment, all the context, and we go, this project's a loser. It's not going anywhere. I could just tell, and then what do you do when you've been handed that assignment? Leaders just to talk about on programs, you want to be in the third wave of leaders. The first one with the initial starting conditions, get it going, but they always run into problems because it's complex. And then they all get replaced. The next wave of leaders come in and they start sorting things out, even though what they do to sort things out is what the ones that they originally replaced would have done. And then they tend to get replaced because they don't fix things fast enough. And then the third wave comes in right when everything's going to get better. And then they're all the heroes. So it's funny sitting in a room with a bunch of executives going, you want to be in the third wave. And a lot of that is context dependent. And a lot of the, say, not being, I'll just say being fired from the program is what they used to say. So being fired from the program is really not because you did a poor job, but because you were just in the wrong place on that curve. That false attribution of success and failure. So in a lot of ways, that's kind of the world that they live in. It's a tough place to be. There's a lot of tough decisions, and you're making a lot of decisions in the cloud, and you're doing the best you can at that point in time. You get in a room full of vice presidents, and you ask them, how many of you have made a really dumb decision? Everybody raises their hands. It was the best thing they knew at that point in time. So anyway, I'm going to stop just for a second and take questions.
Dave, can you stop sharing your screen for a second so I can see if people raise their hands?
Yeah,
thank you.
Good. All right, find it.
Well, and of course, they're always judged, these same executives are judged by past results as well, right? Like it's not enough that you have to it's like, well, 20 years ago, we got $5 million off something like that. Now you're only delivering this and you're talking about all this other stuff. And why would we even bother? Okay. Rika, am I pronouncing that correctly? Has her hand.
Richah.
Richah.
I have a question, David. With the recent mishaps of Boeing and with realizing the learnings from this framework, how have the executives pivoted their approach?
So that's a really good question. So it's interesting when you do these kinds of things, you're trying to create, I'll just call it pockets of understanding and people who use these kind of approaches. Not everyone does. When we taught these classes, what we found was 33% of them thought it was great. They actually said, this is really practical. About a third of them said, this is pretty interesting. There's some good stuff here. And especially the higher up we went in the company, about a third of them said, this is a waste of time. It's theory, which is kind of their way of blowing things off. And a lot of it is they were successful by sort of living in complicated. And it's also interesting that the ones who didn't like it said it was theory, and the ones who liked it said it was practical, which I thought was kind of an interesting contradiction. But, not everyone does, and not everyone in the highest, places of power use these approaches. A lot of times what we tried to do is just create pockets, leaders who go, my organization, we're going to operate this way. So you talk about how does the leaders embrace it? Some have, some haven't. But you still have some of the system is sort of producing the same pressures, the same sort of inclination to try to create the illusion that you're successfully planning everything out. And it's really, really hard. I mean, in our system, and I'm talking about our economic system, where, Wall Street's looking at the quarterly report and everything's aimed at that. And it's really hard to make, say, long-term decisions that may mess up your short-term quarterly reports. Even though we've learned focusing on that in short-term after short-term after short-term can create long-term damage. So, it's a tough situation. So, I mean, it's a good question. I'm not sure I fully answered it, but I'd say some do, some don't. Some areas have really embraced that, and some areas have not.
And that's a great way to approach it, David, because I currently work in WEX, and we face a lot of resistance from executives, especially when we teach certain frameworks and they denounce it as being theoretical. And only with certain leaders with certain mindsets that want to question their preconceived notions or assumptions are the ones who are able to intake this type of knowledge.
Yeah, and there's also timing too. Some leaders don't like it at a point in time, and then later on they go, oh, there's something to this. So, sometimes you have to stay with it. But you're right. Sometimes you just got to find, where the pole is. These are the people who are interested, and this is who we're going to work with. And it was interesting. Like Steve Holt worked a lot in the engineering community. I worked a lot with leaders. And then there were times where we, worked together on projects, which was really cool. But sometimes over time, you create more and more people who are aware of it.
Yeah. And it's good. I mean, you are asking people to overcome not just their experience in business, but like an entire, like the educational institutions are set up to feed that particular mindset, right? About the practical, and so you're asking them to overcome not just the in the moment stuff, but a whole history of training.
Yeah. Yeah. And, and it talked about, sort of the medieval structures. In some ways, like when you're teaching a class at the Boeing Leadership Center, that actually sort of elevates your social status, at least for, 90 minutes. So, it kind of gives you an ability to, impart and have discussions that maybe you wouldn't otherwise have. Or it actually gave me street cred, with other leaders going, yeah, he taught this at the Boeing Leadership Center. So, you kind of find ways to reduce some of those social barriers.
Yeah, queen for a day. David Crow has his hand up.
Yeah, David.
Hey, so we were just talking in chat. I know we decided to break the rules and talk in chat already. I'm joking, don't worry. We were just talking about the fact that you said executives needed to be introduced to complexity, and I said it's slightly worrying that executives need to be introduced to complexity. And Kyle pointed out that execs in the USA need permission to be uncertain. And I thought that was a really interesting observation. And I wondered, do you have any experience with other cultures, and were there differences?
Yeah, so, I mean, we used to we were doing software implementation with different partners around the world for the 787 software platforms. And so we were running meetings that were large scale with 30 different countries in the room. We actually did the same meeting in the morning and in the evening so that we could reach different parts of the world. But yeah, we often adapted what we did with different regions. And I would say many of the Europeans picked up on the complexity stuff a lot quicker than a lot of the Americans. So that was an interesting thing. I actually got complimented by one of our vice presidents who was born and raised in Sweden, and we were talking about something because I was working with him on a project, and he like stopped and went like, "I hope I'm not insulting you, but you think like a European." And it's like, no, it's not. Actually, it's kind of a compliment, but it was just in different cultures. Some are more adaptable or understand the complexes really well. And I will say, too, a lot of leaders, they kind of get complexity, but you kind of hit the point of, permission to talk about it. Because you have to create this illusion that you have a plan for everything and you know what you're doing. And like the permission to be uncertain. There's executives we work with. There's one in the tanker program who goes, yeah, I handle the systems engineers differently than how I handle the structures engineers. Because structures was at that time, it was aluminum. It was complicated. We know it. We've done it for decades. And systems was always you get all the flight boxes on the platform and everyone passes test and I plug them in and together and they don't work. And it's all like trial and error, probe. And so they picked up on it a lot faster and he managed those areas differently. So they get it. In a lot of ways, for like myself, it just gave me a better framework on how to talk about this kind of stuff. And they were also really good. The smart executives are really good at creating sandboxes for people to experiment in and protect and hide it from the other parts of the company.
Thank you. It is interesting because I do get the impression that actually I'm obviously in Europe, as you can probably tell from my accent, that I don't think it's quite the same, but it is something I have noticed with regards our global head office, which is actually in America. So it's interesting. Thank you.
Yeah. Other questions?
Anybody else? Or should Dave move on? Okay.
I have a question, and I think I know the answer to this, but what are your thoughts pre-1997, post-1997, the merger?
Yeah, so, I was thinking of mentioning it, that I didn't mention it yet, but, one of the big changes post-merger was kind of going back to the trade guilds, right? We were heavily dominated by the engineering guild. And post-merger, I'll call it the rise and influence and power of the finance guild. And I think that was a big change. That, a lot of areas were cut back and they kept hiring more and more finance people. And I think a lot of it was called a fundamental misunderstanding of the commercial airplane business. That the McDonnell Douglas culture came out of a defense industry. And so it was heavy on finance and defense industry. It made sense. You're doing government contracts. You need to account for every penny. Used to talk, it's like building a custom home. You're contracting with one person for one thing, and you have to be a good steward of that money and account for every penny. They instituted earned value, which to me, I think is a waste of time, but they did it. And then they got into commercial and they go like, well, you don't know how much anything cost. You don't know how much an airplane cost. And so they said, well, we need to get our hands around this kind of stuff and started bringing in finance people. But commercial airplanes is more like called a builder of a housing development. You know, if I'm building a development with 100 homes in it, a good developer is not going to waste their time telling you how much it costs to build every single home. The homes are not pre-contract, you know, pre-contracted prices. The home's price is set by the market. And so what you're dealing with is you've got a certain market set price for all those homes, and I have to build those 100 homes underneath that price, or I'm going to be in big trouble. And so it's really more about managing your crews and your capacity. It's costing out blocks of 10 homes at a time for, you know, the foundations and the framing and so on. And it's just a different metaphor. It's around capacity management, crew management, and some ways economies of scale, but it's to keep your price lower. But as far as the average cost of a home, you know, you could average it out, but you're wasting your time counting pennies to that level. And I don't think the people who were running the company that they were brought in from the defense background understood that. I don't know if that makes any sense or not, but it's
I had heard that, I guess up to that point, the leadership was always an engineer, and that was the turning point. And I think, in my opinion, we've seen what happens since they stopped that.
Yeah, I would say almost always an engineer. Sometimes they actually work their way out of the factory. That's some factory guys who are senior vice presidents.
I mean, it seems very similar to what happened with General Electric, right? General Electric I believe sort of like came, you know, from a certain place, and then it went to a different place. And of course, if you owned the stock, you loved it. But I think we can all see what happened, basically, and where it ultimately went. And now it's trying to recover.
The same guys, right? So Harry Stonecipher, who came over from McDonnell Douglas and became the COO after the merger, came from GE. Jim McNerney, our CEO for a long time, came from GE. So that influence heavily impacted the company. And it was the MBAs and the finance and so on. So again, you know, that social structure, the class and power and, you know, the guilds were disrupted in a different way. It impacted the system.
And you'd be hard pressed to find an American industry. I can only speak to American industries that has not been impacted in that way, right? Down to like, you know,
right.
My makeup company was the makeup I use was acquired by a venture capitalist, and now it's different.
Yeah.
Okay, Harry has his hand up. Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so my question, because you depicted Florence in this almost like beautiful way. So my question is, have you been the Machiavelli of Boeing?
Well, I could say that maybe there are some others that are Machiavellis of Boeing that are much more deeply political and moving. But yeah, it's kind of an interesting metaphor. I actually got involved in Florence because my daughter was doing her PhD dissertation for early modern European history, and had the rough assignment of going into archives in Florence, Venice, and Lucca primarily. So my wife and I would, you know, force ourselves to go visit every year while she was studying. But they kind of got absorbed into that whole scenario. It's a pretty fascinating world.
Yeah, it must make a lot of, or kind of clear now, because it was a time where you killed your brother just to have some advantage, you know, which is sometimes quite similar to what I see daily.
Well, you know, there are, I'll just call them the corporate, you know, I don't know if call them assassinations, but you know, it is, you know, some people really are Machiavellian, and there's some leaders who are very charismatic in front of groups, and they terrorize their employees, and you got all those things going on, all those internal structures. you definitely need to be aware of that when you're navigating the system.
Well, and the guilds are an interesting, sort of metaphor for this, because of course they had a lot of functions, one of which was to provide training, right? They regulated the training, but they also were there to sort of regulate competition.
Yep.
And, they, as with so many of these kinds of things, it took on a life of its own to the point where it became too exclusionary.
Yeah.
Right? Like suddenly there was no innovation because the guild had everything locked down.
Yeah. In fact, my daughter I ran the chart by her since she knows a lot more about that. And that was one of the things that she had mentioned, what you just said, Barbara. And not only that, they actually locked it down because you didn't want too many people in the guilds because that would disrupt your supply of cheap contract labor.
Yeah.
So they actually intentionally suppressed membership in the guild at a certain level in order to have cheap labor. And, most companies use contract labor quite a bit. So, I mean, again, there's some of those parallels.
Yeah. Well, before Dave moves on to part 2, is there any other questions from the floor? Because I could talk about guilds all day. But you don't want that, believe me.
Well, I'll do a few more slides and then we can have more questions.
Okay, great.
Oh, that's right. I got to share again. Okay. All right. So what I'm going to go through, let's see this. Oops. There we go. I'm going to really quickly run through a few artifacts that I use a lot with leaders and people in the system. And this is one I get a lot of usage out of.
Slides aren't up, Dave.
Sure, Dave.
Okay. That little blue square at the bottom that says share.
There you go.
Yep, there we go.
Up.
So, go back. So this is one I use a lot. I really just took the different boxes in the leaders framework for decision making and mapped them to the Cynefin framework, talking about adaptive leadership and how you lead. I'm not going to go through it all. All these slides are going to be made available afterwards. So when the YouTube thing comes up, Jocko's going to have them added to it. And this is just a good way to talk about when you're in which domain, how do you operate? It was fascinating after one of the classes, it was about a year later, and there was one of the people who went through one of the classes at the Leadership Center. And he said, this was a big change for him personally, that, when things were complicated, he tended to know the answer. He was the IT director. He'd been in IT for a long time. He said, I knew what to do. I could tell people what to do. But it really changed how he approached those big, messy issues that they dealt with. And the big change was he basically said, I shut up and I listened. I asked questions, shut up and listen, and try to get as many different points of view out as possible. One thing we often coach leaders to do is to, when you're in a big, complex situation, never tip your hand on what you're thinking, because people will coalesce around it. Even if you're not fully married to the idea and you wouldn't have a problem if someone disagreed with you. But often the case is people will not disagree with them. They'll start to say, oh yeah, that was a great idea. So, never voice your opinion until a lot of the discussion has taken place. And even then, couch it as this is an opinion, but if you disagree with it, I'm totally down with that. So change how you operate in that complex situation. For this particular leader, he said that was a big life changer. So this is kind of a good way to talk about that. The other thing I've done is I mapped the overall workflow to the Cynefin Framework, with the understanding that nothing's ever 100% in that particular domain. But like product development and strategy and marketing tends to live in the complex domain a lot more. They do a bigger percentage of their work is in that particular domain. The complicated domain, that's where engineering tended to live. Manufacturing tended to live, I'll say on the border, because they were always complicated and clear and going back and forth. The interesting thing that hit me, though, is in a lot of ways, these are the guilds, and they often had different cultures or subcultures that I think were heavily impacted by the domain that they operated a lot within. So product development tended to be a lot more collaborative in their culture. Manufacturing tended to be a lot more hierarchical in their culture. Engineering was a lot of the expert problem solvers. So you had interesting dynamics between the different organizations based on, the kind of work they did and the subcultures that sort of grew out of that. We used to do interventions like engineers and manufacturing. We used to call it when cultures collide, and we would highlight some of the cultural differences and how that often caused sort of misinterpretation of motives. So something to think about, map your work to that particular domain. I was thinking, what would software look like? And this is totally made up from someone who's not a software person and looked at a couple slides on, Google Images. But, different industries may have different curves. Software is heavily testing, kind of going back and forth, and so on. But sometimes it can be really worthwhile to sort of map out the overall flow against Cynefin and what that might look like. And in a lot of cases, the discussion is more valuable than the map. So that's another artifact. One that I use a lot is I just went through all the tools that are out there and I mapped them to the Cynefin Framework. Often creates a lot of discussion when you do this. But it's really useful. I'm really big on, I never use a tool just to use it. It's got to be appropriate to the context. So I think a lot about, what's the context and what's the right tool that I want to use. And in really big projects, you may have, multiple things going on in complex, multiple things going on in complicated. You can be using different tools from different areas, but I always have really high intentionality around it. So I even did things when they were talking about setting up some part of the engineering function. This was before they moved some of it to Charleston in Southern California. And we had all the engineering vice presidents in a room, and we did like a massive pre-mortem before it, like everything that could go wrong. Although I knew they wouldn't like the word pre-mortem, so I used a more positive term, but that's essentially what we did. And they came up with like 9 different things that they were really scared about, different areas. And we actually assigned vice presidents to work together to come up with proposals for each of those 9 areas. And, it was people who don't normally work together. So we're actually using some of the causing people to work across networks that they don't normally work across and creating new network ties as part of that project. So you can do these different tools tailored to the particular situation you're in. Discussions with leaders on multiple pilots. Remember one person, she actually talk about timing. She was someone who was maybe resistant to some of the complex principles at one point in her career. And this was years later, and she was in a different role. And we're talking about running multiple pilots and you have a really bad problem. and really hit her. Like, she even said, I'm solution agnostic. I don't care who wins. I just want a winner. And so a lot of times, people will change based on life experience and roles and the challenges that particular situation they're facing. So again, this is really valuable. And a lot of times, and kind of goes back to when you're doing a project, at any level of the company, they always want a plan. And this is a tool that I often use for planning. And the approach I take is like 3 steps, scan, plan, and act. And the scan is assessing the environment. So you're always, kind of goes back to, you don't use the problem word. What's the situation? What direction do we want to move? I don't have absolute end states, but what's the direction you want to move? What may keep us from getting there? What may help us? So really talking about the environment and scanning. And then, then you start putting together your plan. And I go, okay, what's my approach? And then I can look at that map that I just showed and go, well, what are some potential approaches that'll help get us in that direction? And then you start documenting it out. And then, the implementation monitoring, most of us know how to do that. You implement the plan, you see how it's going, and so on. And your pathways may look different depending upon, is this a complicated problem or a complex problem? So if it's complicated, I do this environmental scan, but that may just be about describing the situation. It may be around, let's just do a process flow map and document the process. And then the typical things that we normally do for complicated problems. So you lay it out. What are your actions? Identify them, create a schedule. Do we need to do a workshop to resolve the different actions and so on? And then you implement your plans. So that would be one approach. If it's complex, generally, if it's complex, I'm going to spend a lot more time in the scanning. You get multiple groups, describe the situations and issues. SenseMaker is really great for doing an environmental scan. We worked with Dave Snowden and Michael Sheveldave a lot on 2 main SenseMaker projects we did at the Boeing company, one around safety and one around decision making and engineering. You can create an S-terrain map, which I regret I was never able to do. It came out just as I was retiring and I never had a good situation to use it. So I'm disappointed, but I'm not going to unretire in order to use it. And then, map potential actions and map them to the Cynefin Framework. And then you create proposals for the actions. I know you can go online. There's a really good template that Dave Snowden has on using complex proposals, how to generate a complex proposal. And then you identify team members for those different probes or pilots. And then, implementing and monitoring. But then kind of going back to when you're in the complex, you're always going back to scan. It's just a constant scan and improve and scan and improve. So you're in that loop. So one thing we do talk a lot about, though, when we're in these, as far as putting your plan together, is if it's complicated, sometimes your plan, you can just use a Gantt chart, simple project management. When it's in the complex, we often planned it out using, they call them horizon charts, but you'd have time horizons, Q1, Q2, Q3. What are we going to do each quarter? Sometimes we would often break it down to monthly, January, February, March. What are we going to do in each one of those months? And then you can kind of check off as you go whether you did it. So there's sort of the visual display of what you're doing. Now, sometimes they want to put milestones to it. Try to avoid that. But if you have to, you have to. So I'm going to go back to Florence, sort of final thoughts. Like I said, I love the building. I love the old, the more medieval ones, the more Gothic buildings than I do the Renaissance ones. There's something that's raw about them that I like. So things to think about, right? Start where you are. And it's really a lot about shifting the dialogue and trying to get people in the same, I'll call the same role space. If it's different work groups, then get them at least from a functional perspective. Trying in some cases to dismantle the hierarchy, not that you're blowing it up, but you're at least dismantling the metaphor of the hierarchy in that conversation. I was talking about roles and identity with a senior leader once, and we're talking about the whole king in his court metaphor. And I said, well, what kind of reaction are you going to get when someone's presenting to you, in the typical meeting conference room in those highly structured environments? And, he said, well, it's going to be basically a performance. When you're presenting in a large conference room to a lot of people, you're essentially, people are performing and you have certain goals, which is one is don't get people mad at you, come out of the meeting with no action to some, items and so on. And so it's very performative based on that particular context. And I said, well, what if you go to that same person and sat down by their desk and say, hey, Bob, how are things going? And he actually said, well, I probably get the truth. I said, yeah, you have a totally different discussion. So try to disrupt the environment and the context of the discussions. So really think about that. And then also think about, how do I sort of create these sort of nudges in the system to move people in a more positive direction? So one of the things that I used to do that I didn't do anymore, I stopped doing, when people would say, well, we need someone to do culture change. And I basically said, I'm not doing culture change. See, Barbara, your hands over your face. You've been there. But yeah, it's like, well, it's not doing culture change, it's like, it's not going to work. You're just wasting your time. And the interesting thing is, like, most leaders kind of knew that, but it's kind of like, this is what we're supposed to do because this is what, leaders are talking about, changing the culture. And so I said, well, instead of doing culture change, let's do this. Let's understand what culture is. Let's understand the system that we're operating in. And let's try to nudge the system in a more positive direction. Or, best case, how do we create an environment in our particular organization that we all really look forward to working in? And what does that look like? And really shifting the role of leaders, instead of the behavioral police and trying to force behaviors, to creating environments so that people will behave differently. Because one of the things we discovered in the SenseMaker projects was all those desired behaviors were already in the system. But within a given context, they would miraculously show up. In other contexts, they didn't. So it's more around, well, create the context to the environment where they're more likely to happen. So that was something we really focused on instead of culture change. How do we create those environments? I had one senior leader, she reported to the C-suite and said, yeah, there are a bunch of alpha personalities there. And it's like, I don't want my group to be like that. So what do we do so we don't act like them? How do we create this pocket where we're actually collaborative and not everybody is trying to, prove that they're the best? And, I think those are really good goals. Whatever level you're at, working where you are, how do you create these positive pockets? With the understanding that if the leader moves on, it probably will deteriorate. I only know of a couple of situations where an organization, large organizations, billion-dollar budgets, were in a really cool place. And then the leader left and they actually maintained it. Both times they promoted from within. They bring someone in from outside, generally your host. So anyway, that's one thing to think about. The other thing about, and this is sort of my last story, one of my last big projects. This was during COVID, and it really illustrates the dynamics of the social systems. But we got the fiat from above So we'll call this the program or the city state. And actually it was the business unit. The business unit, so the highest level, the commercial business unit said, we're going to reorganize all of engineering to have everybody go back to the functions. In the middle of COVID, right? A lot of people were, doing remote work. And so we didn't feel great about it. And what we learned when we started scanning the environment was all the different engineering functions did it differently. Some of them were actually pretty strongly embedded in the program. Some of them weren't. A lot of it depended on the context of the work that they did and how transferable the work was to different programs. So what we did was we took them through the process of, well, let's identify different potential ways that we could do that and what it would look like in different structures if we were totally in the functions. Kind of going back to, people go, well, thinking about these kind of things, it's not scientific. We got to come up with the best way. And we kind of with engineers, you go, well, actually having a hypothesis that how this might work is scientific. And then you test the hypothesis. We call them Einstein thought experiments. If we organize this way, do a thought experiment around how it would work. And we created different scenarios from sort of mild to wild or whatever, and how would that particular structure handle this scenario. So the function kind of put that all together. They presented their different structures that they had settled on about 2 or 3 to the programs. And the programs were really biased on having people in the programs that they can control them and not having a functional organization. So they basically threw up all over it, which was fine. It's like, okay. But basically what it did was it created a coalition between the functions and the programs to go back to the business unit and say, I don't think this is a great idea. And the whole goal of the organizing around functions was to create more functional communication between functions that supported different programs. And so we basically said, well, here's about 5 things we can do that would help solve and address those issues, the communication between the functions on different programs, without having to do a major reorg. So we basically talked them out of it. But we use the different dynamics of the social systems as part of that process. So it's kind of an interesting story. And sometimes, when you're doing this kind of work, you can be really proud of talking people out of doing stuff for the right reasons. And so, it's just something to think about. It's not like always doing what they tell you to do. Sometimes it's creating an environment where they go, well, it's maybe not the best idea. And it'll take about 4 or 5 months. It took a while. But I think it was well worth it. So I'm going to end with 3 thoughts. One is, leadership is about creating environments. And then the other is I often use complex approaches without saying that I'm using complex approaches. This kind of goes back to the mapping the different tools to the domains. It's like, oh, this is a good situation to use future backwards. Steve Holt and I sat on future backwards for a while, and then we were working on a big project where particular function that operated across different business units needed to do common things. And Steve came up with the idea, like, we should run a future backwards on this one. So we pulled it out because it really fit the situation. It really worked well. I got people who did not work together at all that were really thinking the same page. Never mentioned Cynefin, never mentioned complex systems. We just use that particular tool. And the other is take risk and try stuff. A lot of times I just make stuff up. The whole Florence chart, I just made that up. Maybe it's because I got sick and tired of being asked to do culture change and I wanted to do something different. And I was kind of interested in sort of social systems. So I just threw that up there and took it to a vice president and his direct reports and gave it a shot. And more often than not, it works. I can say a couple examples where I did that and it didn't work. But, so what? You got to take risks. Don't be afraid to fail. I got more effective when I hit 55 years old and I was fully vested. And it was like, what are you going to do to me? I still get a pension. I still get everything, okay. So I remember having that conversation. I just turned 55 with, as a leader, Dennis O'Donoghue. If you've ever heard Dave Snowden tell the story about the pilot on the aircraft carrier who was in the room with his fellow pilots, and they were talking about if your plane doesn't catch air when it comes off the aircraft carrier and it starts to go basically below the deck of the carrier, you do these three sort of counterintuitive things really quickly, it will actually save the plane and you can get up. And then Dennis, like several years later, that happened to him. And he remembered, like at that point in time, something he never thought about for like 2 years. And he remembered it and he did it and saved the airplane. So Dave Snowden tells that story. So I was actually in the room when Dave and Dennis were sharing that story. Dennis was like my all-time greatest client at the Boeing company. And we were having the discussion where I was 55 and just turned in about how great it is being fully vested. And he's like, I'm a year away. I can't wait. So, sometimes, a lot of middle-level managers are really maligned as being the problem. But a lot of my best clients have been middle or sort of the upper middle guys who are fully vested and they're not afraid to make mistakes and they're just going to do the right thing. And those are often the greatest people to work with. So something to keep in mind, taking risks, the value of taking risks. My biggest regret is maybe I didn't take more risk earlier. So I'm going to end on that. I do have some stuff in the back. I have the reading list of influences. In the PDF file, there's guidelines for running workshops that I have. And the last one, I just put this together. So I don't know if Dave has seen this. I'll probably send it to him. But anyway, you probably get a kick out of it. And I did it in Latin because I thought, he would think that was cool. So anyway, that's basically it. I'm going to stop sharing.
Well, there's a lot going on in the chat.
Oh, good.
Does anybody have any questions right now? Raise your hand. If not, I'm going to start pulling
57.
things. Yeah, I'm going to start pulling things out of the chat that, look interesting to me, and we'll talk about it. Kyle, something put you in your feelings. Was that something Dave said, or was it something that happened in the chat?
Oh no, it was the slide that had the word designer somewhere between clear and complicated. Yeah.
So you have to keep in mind that was, the one was design engineering, which is different than designer, like in software. So that's something to keep in mind. But yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so you're okay. You're okay now? Okay.
I walked it off.
We're nothing if not about feelings here at the
Yes,
Lounge,
we're all in the feelings here. So Dave, one of the interesting things I noticed in your thing, and this is something we talk about a lot, was your use of language. Like you use the word pilot a lot, and it seemed like you were talking about safe to fail experiments, but you used their language, which was pilot, which I think is another aspect of this that's super important, right? Is that when we're here, we use all of these words, but when you're trying to introduce these concepts to an organization, you have to latch on to their vocabulary.
Right. Yeah, if you use probe, that sounds more like alien abductions, so yeah, pilots, experiments.
Yeah, there's just something about the way we use language when we talk about this when we're trying to introduce it to people, who may or may not be interested, that I think is sort of a super important thing.
Yeah, and there's a fine line between where do you introduce new terms and then where do you use terms in the system. And it is also being aware of how people use the words in the system. And the danger too, when you introduce new terms, is you really have to be aware of how people are using them, because they may be using them differently than how you think they're actually defined. So you really gotta sometimes ask a lot of like, what do you mean by that questions?
Yeah. Yeah, we've had a couple of requests for the slide deck. And then also there's once again, Buckminster Fuller has reared his head in the chat.
Well, I don't know where that came from. I wasn't thinking anything about it, but anyway.
I know, but he comes up all the time. So, I'm not quite sure. It was around the word emergence. And David Crow, you have feelings.
I was going to say, actually, Fuller is actually just an emergent property of chat at this point.
Well, I can see that. I've been there before.
And then I was going to back off as that dome.
But yeah, the word emergence, David, you seem to have some feelings about that. Is it just related to your work, or is it that you find it's a difficult concept for people to grasp?
I think it's more, I do think people find it difficult to grasp, right? Because they learn a Platonic system where everything is defined by its characteristic properties and its essences. And then you say, yeah, but like emergent properties don't work like that. And they start crying because that's not how they're being taught to work. So it is a problem in that sense. But specifically, it's philosophy in this case, because emergence appears to be linked to transcendence, and I'm trying to reconcile that at the moment. So this is my own crisis. It's fine. I'll get over it eventually.
That's what we're here for, to work it out.
That's right.
This is where we work things out, work these crises out.
Kyle, I might take you up on the offer of dropping some ideas, though. So I was just about to drop my LinkedIn to you. So if you want to connect, that's where I am.
Okay. All right. What else is going on in the chat that looks interesting? Emergence is a difficult concept. Yes, it is, but it's also a loaded concept in many ways. When you use the word emergence, we all bring our own baggage to every piece of terminology, but emergence has been abused in so many ways. Here goes, Yuliya has her hand up. Yuliya.
No, just finish your thought about emergence.
No, I was just thinking about the way that again, it goes back to the language question, right? Like emergence is one of those words that like you use it and it immediately conjures up ideas in people's head that are in some cases antithetical to what you're talking about.
It's usually used as a shortcut for something else.
Yeah. Okay,
speaking about the linguistic parts, yeah, sometimes it's much easier to introduce a word that nobody knows, like for example, Cynefin, and just give a very clean and clear formulation, and then as David Snowden makes everybody say it several times, still he understands that the recipient understood the same word, because otherwise, there is a lot of mishaps. So I normally have the same question for the last year, and Barbara knows that question already, and she's already laughing at me. But I'm the practical person, because I need to teach all of this in the business school. And Dave, I need to tell you that I already want to ask you permission to show one of your slides with your obviously reference, where you put all or several instruments on the domains, because as a part of the, for example, consulting course, when we teach all those instruments that they exist, what to do, when to do, like one summary slide like that can already be a very eye-opening experience, so that whoever said in the chat, who was shocked that we still need to teach this to the executives, Yeah, so my point is that we need to teach this more in the business schools when the kids are still young and, SpongeBob's, taking all this information. So, however, I wanted to talk about the next two slides as well, where you mapped different processes or different parts of the production.
Oh, yeah.
Because like when you use the instrument, like if you are in this domain, you use this instrument, then it is a guidance, right? So this is prescriptive. But with the processes, like there's so much context, there's so much different silos, there is so much different, like who is the new people and so on. Do you think it actually so how it was helpful for you? How did you actually do this? Did you come and bring this map, or did you create them together? So was it an emergent thing and you understood that this is the way our processes are in February? So could you expand on
Yeah, so that particular one,
Thank you
sort of
so much.
mapping our overall flow to the Cynefin framework, that's something I just made up. And I would show it to groups, and it would generate a lot of discussion around the interactions between the groups and what might be going on. So a lot of it was oriented towards creating discussion, creating awareness of the different domains, but what's some of the interactions that may need to occur in order for the overall flow to work. With the intent of every chart I show is my best guess of what that might look like. And I often learn a lot more by having the discussion with people. Kind of goes back to taking risk. A lot of times in meetings, I go, oh, this looks kind of like this. And somebody will go, no, that's not it. It's actually more like this. But I don't care if I get corrected if it furthers the discussion. So it's a nice chart to use to start the discussion, but it's not necessarily the ending point to get it exactly right.
More an exercise to put people on the same page, right?
Yeah, and you create really interesting discussions. I was talking to someone who was working with teams in the factory, and he's also a psychologist by training, and he looks at it and goes, oh my gosh, this explains a lot of what's going on in the factory. Is all their work is, in the clear space, and it's kind of boring. So they create a lot of drama in the complex area to make their lives interesting. So, it can kind of trigger a lot of insights and discussions by sort of laying those kind of things out. I don't know, does that help or? Yeah. So Kyle has his hands up or?
Yeah. So I think I might have mentioned this here before. Dave, you might have heard this. I feel like complexity's ambulance chaser often. Like I'm looking for the stakeholders and the projects that have gone through all of the MBA, the traditional ways of working. It's all failed them. And now they're in this state of like futility has overwhelmed them, and they're willing to take those risks to try these new processes, to include these new people in the conversations. And I got really sensitive to looking for the difference between people that want to bring me in to build the 24-month roadmap versus the ones that are just like broken and battered. And I know how predatory that sounds and it sucks, but I'm wondering if you do a similar evaluation or if that has mattered at all in how you've approached selecting projects, working with leaders, that sort of thing.
Well, I mean, so there's two things. Often I don't, selecting projects, sometimes they were selected for me, right? Go work with this guy. And that's where you kind of start that initial approach. Like, okay, let's not talk about problems. How messy is it? Where are you on that continuum? And then kind of see how far the client is willing to go. Some are willing to go farther than others. So that's kind of one thing. Sometimes it does come out though that they need to try those complexity approaches, but they're also within a system that may not be super friendly to them. And how do I, it's like if they want a 1-year plan, then give them a 1-year plan, but you're planning doing these complex approaches with the understanding, and hopefully you can put your plan in vague enough language so that it gives you a lot of flexibility to go different directions. So that's kind of what, we often did. You don't want to get too concrete around your end goals, but say we're going to be headed in this direction, and these are going to be the signs that we're headed in that direction. What I found is really fascinating. I used to do a lot of meetings with executives at the end of the year, their goals for the next year. And you have all the stuff on setting SMART goals, with very well defined and all that. And what I discovered is executives don't like SMART goals. They like ambiguous goals. There's a certain strength in having that, and it kind of goes back to, the immune system. Like part of it goes, well, is the immune system fighting that? Or is that really kind of a good idea for the world they live in? When you're living in the cloud, having ambiguous goals is maybe a good thing.
Can I ask a clarifying question there?
Yeah.
Is it that they don't like SMART goals for themselves, but they love it for everybody else, or they just don't like SMART goals in general?
Well, yeah, there is that. There is that. But there's also this sort of game where at every level, everyone's kind of like, you don't want to get pinned down. And the thing is, too, at the executive level, they're put together their goals for the year, and a lot of them are assigned to them by their boss. And then they have this list of 20 goals. And they all know, and we've had this conversation, there's 3 of them that I'm going to get in big trouble if I don't hit. And then there's a bunch of others where I can do some stuff on the side in that direction. And then there's a couple I might intentionally ignore unless somebody asks for it. So, there's just a lot of games around goals. I'll just leave it at that. Rebecca.
Well,
Hi.
sorry, let me pile on a little bit. Like a good example of where I'm seeing this. I'll get somebody that runs in and says, I want you to knock down all the organizational silos. The answer is centralization, and you understand systems thinking and complexity, so you do it. And my answer is you can't knock down silos, and then they move on to the next person that they think can. I want the person that is also essentially asking the same question, but they're like the broken kindergarten teacher at the end of the week that's just like hanging on for dear life, that's saying, why can't everyone get along? And they're not expressing, I want the centralization, I want the silos knocked down. They're just, you can tell they're exhausted. That's who I'm looking for.
Yeah.
And this seems to be consistent with a lot of large companies, even though they say they're agile, if you really look at them, they're not agile at all. They're just using jargon to make it sound like they're agile. They don't generally understand the first thing about agile. And when we talk about silos, right, that goes back to the 70s with waterfall. And so when, for instance, now everybody's giving up on agile, or at least in a big way, people are getting laid off all over the place. And so what are they doing? They're regressing to like solid waterfall. And we know that didn't work, because why would agile have ever been born if waterfall was such a great thing? But I've always said this, people are stuck in their waterfall. They love their waterfall because they think somehow, okay, I'm going to plan this. I'm going to plan the heck out of this. So you spend 3 years in a design phase, and 1 month out of the design phase, you're like, oh, I forgot this. Oh, I forgot that. Oh, I forgot.
Yeah.
That's why it failed. But yet we regress to it. And this whole idea of siloing is ridiculous too. The best teams are cross-functional, which comes from Scrum. That's, you don't want just a whole team of hardware engineers, a whole team of software engineers. You want them all integrated into one team, and you want to be, like they were talking about before, you want to have emergence. where you learn more as you go. And every day you learn something new. You probably learn a few new things, and then you inspect and adapt and you move on, basically.
Well, and they're bringing the knowledge though and skills that have been raised from the silos. I mean, you want that too. So,
okay,
but you need to work across. That was Rebecca.
Rebecca had been very patient. Yes.
Yes.
So
Okay.
Rebecca.
I have a couple of comments. Having thought about and being in various waves, like in Agile and in engineering organizations and whatever, one of the things that's interesting to me is I've seen people who are effective at introducing change into the organizations are very clever at using the terms and the justification that fits into their corporate culture. So I remember very early back in the days where a person who was a fellow at Medtronics introduced Agile as, he says, I'm not going to talk about any manifesto. Heck, we build medical instruments, but we do have to talk about adapting and getting complex engineering stuff done. So yes, we do have. So he uses, but he didn't talk about the Agile manifesto. I know people that says we're introducing a process where we meet together, but we're not going to call it Scrum. So anyway, that's just an observation, is that it's more important, I think, for a culture to understand in their world what you're wanting to do rather than having some standard reference, unless you want outside consultants to come in and tell you what Agile is or tell you what it is. So I've seen leaders do that, and it's very effective. Anyway, so that was just one observation that I had. Another question, though, I had is when you were talking about, getting people that are in a position, finding pockets to get people to understand and appreciate approaching different. It seems to me like that is sort of like guerrilla tactics, David.
Yeah.
and that at some point, depending upon the culture and the it's doomed to not be that successful. And I don't know if you had thoughts about that. It's going to be quashed.
Well, yes and no, right?
Okay.
Definitely guerrilla tactics. Steve and I spread it at all different levels where possible, to the point where both of us would be talking to someone and they go, hey, there's this thing called Cynefin. Have you heard of it? And it's like, yeah, I brought it into the company. But that's cool. I mean, it's cool when it starts showing up. People use day-to-day lives. Does it get squashed? I feel like these things go through cycles. I mean, even us presenting at the Leadership Center, we had a vice president who was really great to work for. When we got like 33% said, yeah, this is theory, not getting anywhere. He actually wrote me a personal email and said, hey, Dave, keep doing this. This is what the Leadership Center should be about. It should be a place where people get exposed to new ideas and new thinking, and they're not all going to like it. And that's a good thing. So we had a good 2-year run, and then they decided to shorten the length of the classes. A new vice president was in charge of the Leadership Center. And then they had a bias towards, we'll bring people from outside to do it. And they brought in people doing VUCA, and, we got quashed. It's the
outside authority. Yes. And so the executive.
It's not like you get disappointed. It's more the attitude is, we had a good 2-year run, but we also created, pretty good mass of people who, understood the concepts. And even if it didn't always help the company, it often helped them personally. And there's nothing wrong for, people being better off because they know this stuff.
Yeah, no, I agree. But I'm just I'm thinking about my career and doing these sort of guerrilla tactics, and you go,
Yeah.
and then I will meet people in different companies many years later who've been influenced, and that's good, but that's sometimes what you can hope for. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's okay.
Yeah.
Like, my dad was an HR director who also did some organization development. He said, yeah, if you're going into this line of work to be a hero, you're in the wrong line of work. But that's okay, you know, because you can have a lot of successes, but you know, very few of us are in a position where we can like save the company.
So thanks. I enjoyed your talk.
You made a point earlier too when we were, you know, about teaching it to others. Steve and I were actually presenting to the whole leadership team for product development. They asked to learn more about Cynefin and do a deeper dive because we had already worked with a couple of the people individually. So we were doing the whole group. And we went through the Cynefin framework and all that. And it's like real sort of a collective silence. And they go, you know, it's complex domain. They don't teach that. You know, engineers do not get that. At least not many. You know, MBAs don't get that. You know, they all teach in the complicated zone. In the more and more, you know, you can start looking at what are these tools and approaches for the complex world. The only engineers we got a really quick, immediate traction with were the test engineers. Because they had tons of life experiences of you test something that everything on paper looks good and it doesn't work.
Yep.
And they're doing constant probe, sense, respond in order to get the systems to work.
That's fascinating. I started out as a test engineer at Tektronix and then moved up to engineering ranks. And so I realized that the hardest thing to tell any manager is, I don't know. I need to find out. You know, that just culturally just not allowed
to
be that way. Oh, so make something up. It's like I've had managers tell me that.
Well, sometimes, you know, you're constantly doing these like mini probes with leaders. Like, is it safe to say, I don't know? Because sometimes that's a myth. You know, sometimes you do get in trouble for saying it. Sometimes you go, beats me. I don't know. I'll find out and I'll send you something tomorrow. So sometimes you have to test at least, you know, once or twice to see how far you can go. You know, it's kind of like I'm the 3-year-old in the room, you know, sort of pushing it. How far can it go?
All the time.
You know, and so you're doing like these little mini probes, you know, how far can I go with this person?
Yeah, you have to manage your manager.
Yeah.
One way to deal with that is just to say, you never say, I don't know, but one way is to just say, is to really buy yourself time. So say, well, I think we could go this way, or I think we could go that way. But I need to investigate and then, you know, try to come up with something or talk to colleagues, things like that. But you never say, I don't know. And whenever you have a problem, and you're going to go to your manager, you need to offer them 3 solutions and let them pick the solution, but never walk in there unprepared.
Yeah, we used to, there was actually it was a leader that I worked with, and he was running one of the major airplane programs, and he used to freak people out because they would give technical presentations to him. And then there'd be the long pause where they're waiting for the vice president to tell them what to do. And he would always ask them, okay, so you're the expert, what do you think? Which is really a great question when you think about it. So we had to like coach people, you know, say, you know, before you talk to Eric, you better have an idea of what you think he should do, because he's going to ask you. You know, and after they got used to it, it was empowering. But, you know, a lot of people, there's this dance where they're waiting for the leader to step in. And leaders will fill the void, but both of them have to like stop that dance.
Well, if you look at, you know, Apollo 13, right? One of the biggest quotes that came out of that is failure is not an option. Managers don't want to hear the word failure or I don't know. You know, many of them can lose their careers over one failure if it's big enough.
It's possible. Or, you know, our case often was your career might be derailed for a couple of years. You become the vice president in charge of quality for paper clips. They used to call that, like in the old Chinese days, you know, being sent to the rice paddies. If I blow this, I get sent to the rice paddies for my sort of political correction. And then maybe I'll be able to emerge a couple of years later. Those are the kind of stories you hear. I mean, these are like real things as part of their life.
Yeah, I've seen managers when they hit like a certain level, if they screw up at those higher levels, you are easily canned, or they move you into something where you just don't want to do it to try to get you out, basically.
Yeah, definitely seen a lot of that.
Yeah, it seems like you're just retelling the slow horses now. Have you seen this on Apple, I think? It was about the CIA, I don't know, somebody who made a mistake and was sent to the cellar to work to the creepiest guy and so on. So that's, you know, the cultural stuff.
Yeah, I mean, it's like all organizations. My parents went to high school way out in the fringe of the LA County School District, the Sunland Tahunga. And of course, all the teachers they wanted to get rid of, they sent to that school. You know, I mean, that happens. Or, you know, the new teacher gets the worst kids. You know, a lot of systems have those dynamics.
As if it is still 1970s. Or we're coming back to when it was great again.
Yeah.
Well, you really touched the nerve here, Dave, in the chat.
Yeah, don't get me going on that.
Or you could be a great teacher, but you cause problems with your principal and you go down the same road.
Yeah, it's possible, you know.
I've seen that.
Yeah, definitely have that. Well,
before we wrap up,
both my siblings are teachers, so I've heard those stories. Jocko.
Yeah, sort of an underlying theme here, but this idea of managers or management or senior management pressures for or things that show up as long-term versus short-term thinking, I think is an underlying theme as to everything we've been talking about, particularly in the last 15 minutes. Do you want to address that in terms of how you've encountered it? Mostly it's in the form of people don't want to hear bad news because it's short-term thinking, and then they have pressures that forcing them to have short-term thinking. It just seems to be an undercurrent theme to all this.
Well, and I think a lot of that theme is accelerated by, and you know, I can only reference my own company, but a lot of managers, especially the higher up you go, they're in those jobs for relatively short periods of time. You know, it's not unusual for them to be moved 2 years later. So you're often doing things that are going to benefit me immediately because I'm not going to be in this organization 5 years from now. One colleague I had years ago said he had a theory was every new leader comes into an organization and they feel compelled that, you know, I got to add something to show that I'm being a leader. So they add something new, but they don't have enough knowledge about taking something old away. So they just leave it. And all these old things that people added over years are just getting layered and layered on. Because you need to be smart when you stop doing stuff, which is, yes, a nice analogy for what's going on today. But it's very short-term focused.
Well, I think there's a whole presentation we could do about the multiple time scales within organizations, right? Because everybody, like almost every level of the organization is operating at a different time scale.
True.
And a lot of the the issues and the clashes that we see are because those timescales are not aligned. And I think Jay Bloom, Tiani, it's Jay that talks a lot about this, right? The misalignment of timescales within an organization. And that's a very difficult as you say, that's a very difficult problem to address because so many people move around the organization so much, and their impact is very short-lived anyway within any given silo.
Yeah, and I know Jay Bloom has referenced Elliot Jacks. If you want to look at leadership and timescales and complexities, good person to look into. And that's a big deal. And also some leaders, I know one leader who they operated great in the manufacturing complicated environment. The person was brilliant. And then when that person got in product development, they really struggled. They wanted to lean everything out. And it was a disaster to the point where I actually had one of her direct reports, the director level, had a meeting at 7 o'clock every Friday morning for him and his peers, whoever was available that week, to talk about how are we going to handle stuff. And they wanted to do it hidden from their vice president. It was one of the best meetings I ever was involved in too. But some people can operate in one environment, not the other. So you have to be aware of that. But you're right, a factory person, their time scale is how long that airplane is in their control code. So it can be anywhere from 3 to 7 days. That's their time scale, period. In product development, you're thinking 5 years.
Not anymore.
Yeah, no, it's
well, yeah.
Yeah. Well, in manufacturing that it can be that kind of time scale. Well, all right. Does anyone have any more questions? Because I see a lot of stuff in the chat that I don't even understand. And so if you have any of those comments.
Don't tell us that, Barbara. That's the last thing you want to say to us.
I'm merely decorative at this point. But any more questions? Any comments? Positive for knowing. Okay, Tiani.
I guess it's time to wrap up then. So thank you so much, Dave, for coming today. And we always learn so much from your experience and from all the different roles that you described in the beginning and the different parts of the organization, specific organization you worked with, that's helped bring this topic to life. And so we really appreciated that. Thank you everyone for your participation and questions and comments as well. And then the chat. Usually we tee up our next speaker, but we're still working on that for the next month. So stay tuned. So I won't say who it is, potentially. You'll have to wait and see.
Bye. Yeah, watch your inboxes. Watch, see what's coming up next. Bye everyone. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye. Enjoyed it.